People think the most dangerous moment in a city is when someone fires a gun, but they're wrong. The most dangerous moment is when a powerful man asks a quiet question and everyone realizes he expects an honest answer. The night I learned that lesson started like every other shift at Rossi's Italian kitchen on West 47th Street, with tired feet, a forced smile, and a layer of makeup thick enough to hide the things I didn't want anyone asking about. The dinner rush had already begun, the soft glow of chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors while businessmen loosened their ties and couples celebrated promotions and anniversaries. The air smelled like garlic, red wine, and money. The kind of place where a single bottle on the menu cost more than my weekly rent for my tiny studio apartment in Queens. I balanced a tray of water glasses against my shoulder and reminded myself to keep moving, keep smiling, keep my sleeves pulled down. That last part mattered more than the first. 2. Because long sleeves in July raised questions, and questions were dangerous when the truth behind them wasn't something you wanted to explain to strangers. The bruise around my wrist had turned that ugly yellow shade that meant it was almost healing, almost invisible, almost forgotten, almost. I adjusted my cuff again as I stepped between tables, pretending not to notice the way my hand trembled slightly when I set down a glass. No one in the dining room paid attention anyway. Wealthy customers rarely looked directly at waitresses unless they needed something, and that was fine with me. Invisibility was a kind of safety. At least that's what I believed until the front doors opened and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees without the thermostat moving an inch. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they softened, voices lowering the way they do when someone important walks into a room. I followed everyone else's gaze toward the entrance and saw 4 men in dark suits stepping inside. They weren't loud, they weren't flashy, but something about the way they moved made the entire restaurant shift around them like water around a stone. And at the center of that quiet gravity was a man I had never seen before, but somehow immediately recognized as the one who mattered. He was tall, maybe 6'2", broad shoulders under a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, dark hair brushed back from a face that looked calm in the way a winter lake looks calm, still, controlled, and cold enough that you didn't want to test the surface. Alexander Kane. I didn't know his name yet, but everyone else seemed to, because the manager straightened his jacket and hurried toward their table before they even reached it. I lowered my eyes and focused on refilling a nearby water glass, reminding myself of rule number 1 in service work. Don't stare at powerful people. They either hate it or notice too much. But as I turned to leave the table, I felt it, that strange prickling awareness when someone is watching you with complete attention. The kind that makes the back of your neck warm even in an air-conditioned room. I told myself not to look. I really did. But curiosity won the same way it always does. And when my eyes lifted across the dining room, they met his. Alexander Kane wasn't talking to the men with him. He wasn't checking the menu. He was simply watching the room, slowly, carefully, like someone who had learned that details mattered. And when his gaze landed on me, it didn't slide away the way most customers did. It paused. Not in a rude way, not in a flirtatious way, but in a way that made my stomach tighten because it felt like being studied rather than noticed. 3 seconds, maybe 4. That was all it lasted before I forced myself to look down again and move toward the kitchen doors. But in that brief moment, something inside me shifted with the quiet certainty of a lock turning in a door, because I had this sudden, uneasy feeling that the most observant man in the city had just seen something I had spent weeks trying to hide. I told myself it was nothing, just another wealthy customer who happened to glance my way. But the strange weight of that moment followed me through the swinging kitchen doors like a shadow that refused to stay behind. The kitchen at Rossi's was a completely different world from the dining room, loud, bright, and hot enough that the air felt thick against your skin. Cooks shouted orders over the hiss of sauté pans while plates slid across stainless steel counters in a constant rhythm that never really stopped. Maria stood near the dessert station cutting slices of tiramisu, while the pastry chef argued with a line cook about table 14's order. Normal chaos, safe chaos, the kind that kept your mind busy enough not to think about anything else. I placed my empty tray on the counter and tried to shake off the feeling that someone had been reading me like a book across the room. "You look pale," Maria said without looking up from her plate. "I am fine," I answered automatically, the same way I always did when someone asked questions that got too close to the truth. She raised one eyebrow, but did not push it further, because waitresses at Rossi's learned quickly that everyone had something they preferred not to explain. Marco, the floor manager, appeared beside the order printer with his usual anxious energy. Table 8 needs another bottle of Cabernet, and Table 12 just sat down, he said while flipping through the reservation list like it might bite him. The VIP table. Tonight, he added quietly. I knew which table he meant without asking because everyone in the building had noticed when those men walked in. The kind of presence that did not require introductions. I wiped my hands on my apron and picked up a tray with a fresh bottle of wine, reminding myself again of the simplest rule in the service industry. Do the job, keep your head down, and leave the powerful people alone. The dining room looked even more elegant after the bright chaos of the kitchen. The low music from the string quartet drifting through the air, while candlelight reflected across rows of crystal glasses. I approached Table 12 slowly and kept my eyes on the bottle as I placed it on the table. The men sitting there looked exactly the way powerful men usually looked in places like this. Tailored suits, quiet confidence, voices low and controlled. But the man at the center did not join their conversation. Alexander Kane sat slightly back from the table with one arm resting against the chair, observing the room with that same calm focus I had noticed before, the kind of attention that made small details feel suddenly important. I could feel his gaze again before I even turned toward him. It was not intrusive, not aggressive, just steady, as if he was noticing things other people overlooked. I poured the wine carefully into the first glass, then the second, reminding myself to keep my sleeve down while I moved the bottle between them. The bruise around my wrist throbbed faintly under the fabric like a quiet warning. When I reached the third glass, something small and stupid happened. The heel of my shoe caught against the leg of the chair behind me, and the tray tilted just slightly. Not enough to spill anything, but enough that my balance shifted forward for half a second. And in that brief moment, a hand moved faster than my own reflexes and steadied the edge of the tray before it could fall. It was a simple motion, controlled and careful, the kind someone made without thinking. When I looked up, I realized it was him. Alexander Kane's hand had stopped the tray before the glasses even had a chance to rattle. Careful, he said quietly, his voice calm, and even like someone commenting on the weather rather than saving a stranger from embarrassment. I nodded. Quickly, thank you, I said, trying to step back before my nerves made the situation more awkward than it already was. But as I moved, my sleeve slipped just enough for the edge of my cuff to slide up my wrist, and for the briefest moment, the fading bruise beneath the fabric was no longer hidden. I saw the shift in his expression immediately. Not anger, not curiosity, something quieter and more serious. The way someone looks when they notice a detail that changes everything they thought they understood. His eyes lifted from my wrist to my face, and the silence between those 2 seconds felt strangely heavier than the noise of the entire restaurant around us. I should have pulled my sleeve down immediately, but shock has a strange way of slowing the body and speeding the mind at the same time. For a second, I simply stood there with the wine bottle still in my hand, and the faint outline of the bruise exposed to the soft candlelight of Table 12. Alexander Kane did not move his hand away from the edge of the tray right away, not in a threatening way, not even in a controlling way. It was simply steady, the way someone might hold a door open for a stranger without thinking twice about it. But his attention had shifted completely, and I could feel it with the uncomfortable certainty of someone standing under a spotlight. The rest of the restaurant continued moving around us with its quiet music and polite conversation, yet the small space between that table and my tray felt strangely still. I lowered the bottle and quickly adjusted my sleeve, trying to pretend nothing unusual had happened. I am sorry about that, I said, quietly, forcing a polite smile that I had practiced 1,000 times during long shifts. Thank you for catching it. Most customers would have nodded and returned to their conversations, but Alexander Kane did not look back at the men seated beside him. His gaze remained calm and focused the same way it had been when he first walked into the room. Except now it carried something different. Not suspicion exactly. Not curiosity either. Something closer to careful attention. The kind someone uses when they are deciding whether a small detail matters more than it appears. His hand finally released the tray, and I stepped back half a pace, preparing to move away from the table before my nerves betrayed me. But his voice stopped me before I could turn toward the next customer. It was not loud, and it did not interrupt the room. Yet somehow I heard it clearly over the soft music and the clink of silverware. Who did this to you? The question was simple and spoke in the same way someone might ask about the weather outside. Calm and direct without any trace of accusation. For a second my mind did not understand what he meant, and then the meaning landed all at once like cold water across the back of my neck. My fingers tightened around the neck of the wine bottle, and I felt the old instinct rise inside me, the one that always appeared whenever someone asked the wrong question. Deny everything and keep moving. It was nothing. I answered quickly almost before he finished speaking. I hit my wrist on a door at home earlier this week. Clumsy moment. The explanation sounded thin even to my own ears, but years of practice had taught me how to say those words without hesitation. I forced a small laugh and glanced toward the other men at the table, hoping the conversation would move on naturally. One of them was studying the menu, while another scrolled through his phone, neither appearing interested in the exchange. Yet Alexander Kane remained completely still, as if the entire dining room had faded into the background behind my answer. He watched me the way someone watches a card player who just made a risky move, quiet and patient, and I realized with a slow, uncomfortable certainty that he did not believe the story I had offered. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it stretched long enough for my heartbeat to become loud in my ears. Finally, he leaned back slightly in his chair, and the intensity in his gaze softened just enough that the moment felt less like an interrogation and more like a quiet understanding passing between strangers. Accidents happen, he said calmly, and the words could have ended the conversation right there if not for the way he studied my face for another second, as if memorizing something. I nodded once more and turned toward the next table, determined to leave the moment behind me. Yet as I walked away, I could not shake the strange feeling that the question had not really ended at all. It had only just begun. I tried to convince myself that the moment at table 12 had ended the second I walked away, but the strange weight of his attention followed me through the rest of the dining room, like a quiet echo that refused to fade. I delivered 2 plates of pasta to a couple celebrating their anniversary near the windows and refilled water glasses at a table of lawyers discussing some merger deal. The usual rhythm of the restaurant continued exactly the way it always did on a Friday night in Manhattan. Polite laughter, low music, the soft clink of silverware against porcelain plates. Yet I felt slightly out of step with it all, as if part of my mind had stayed behind at that corner table. Maria passed by me carrying a tray of desserts and gave me a curious look. "You are walking like someone just saw a ghost," she whispered under her breath. I forced a quick smile. "Nothing like that," I said, "just tired tonight." She shrugged and continued toward the dining room, leaving me alone with the uneasy awareness that my hands still felt unsteady. I reached the service station near the bar and set down the empty bottle I had been carrying. Taking a slow breath the way people do when they are trying to reset their nerves before returning to work. Across the room, I could still see table 12 out of the corner of my eye. The men there had resumed their quiet conversation as if nothing unusual had happened. One of them gestured with his fork while speaking, and another leaned back in his chair listening with mild interest. But Alexander Kane was not looking at them. He had turned slightly toward the dining room again, watching the movement of waiters and customers with that same calm patience that made it impossible to guess what he was thinking. The unsettling part was realizing that every time I crossed the room his eyes seemed to notice, not in a way that made a scene, but in a subtle way that suggested he was aware of every step I took. The manager Marco hurried past me carrying a tray of appetizers and whispered, "Remember, table 12 is priority service tonight. They do not wait for anything." I nodded quickly, even though I had no intention of returning there unless absolutely necessary. Unfortunately, the kitchen had other plans. The order bell rang sharply, and the head chef called out, "Table 12 main course ready." Marco looked around the kitchen doorway and pointed directly at me. "Lily, take it now." I hesitated for half a second before picking up the large tray, holding 4 plates of steak and roasted vegetables. The plates were heavy and still steaming from the kitchen heat, and I balanced them carefully against my arm before stepping back into the dining room. The walk toward that table felt longer than it should have, maybe 20 feet across polished marble floors, yet every step seemed to echo slightly louder than the music around me. When I reached the table, I lowered the first plate in front of the man seated closest to the aisle, then the second and third, without making eye contact. By the time I reached Alexander Kane, the tray felt suddenly heavier in my hands, though I knew it was only my nerves playing tricks on me. I placed the final plate in front of him and began to lift the empty tray away when his voice stopped me again. It was the same calm tone he had used before. quiet enough that no one else at the table reacted, yet clear enough that I could not pretend I had not heard it. Accidents happen, he said, as if continuing the earlier conversation that everyone else had forgotten. But sometimes accidents leave stories behind them. I looked up slowly, unsure what answer he expected this time. The candlelight reflected in his eyes, making them appear darker than before. For a moment he said nothing else, and the silence stretched just long enough for me to realize something unsettling. He was not questioning me to embarrass me, or even to accuse me of anything. He was simply giving me the chance to tell the truth if I wanted to. I swallowed quietly and shook my head. It really was nothing, I said again, keeping my voice steady, even though my pulse had started racing in my ears. His expression did not change, and after another second, he nodded once, as if accepting the answer without believing it. Then he turned his attention back to the plate in front of him and picked up his fork. "You may go," he said gently, and the words sounded almost like permission rather than dismissal. I stepped away from the table, feeling both relieved and strangely unsettled, because as I walked back toward the kitchen, I realized something with growing certainty. The question he had asked earlier had not disappeared. It had simply been placed somewhere quiet where it could wait until the truth decided to surface. I told myself the night would return to normal after that the strange tension at table 12 would dissolve back into the usual rhythm of clinking glasses and polite conversations. But the longer the evening went on, the more I felt the quiet pressure of something unseen moving beneath the surface of the room. Like the air just before a summer storm when everything looks calm, but you know the weather is about to change. I stayed busy carrying plates and clearing tables because movement was easier than thinking. Every minute filled with orders and refills and polite smiles that felt painted onto my face. Yet every time I crossed the dining room, I felt the same awareness flicker across my shoulders. That steady gaze from the corner table, noticing more than it should. Alexander Kane never called me over again, and he never raised his voice or made a scene. But something about the way he observed the room made it impossible to forget he was there. It was the kind of presence that did not demand attention and somehow commanded it anyway. About 40 minutes passed before the dinner rush began to fade, and the first wave of customers asked for their checks. The music softened slightly as the quartet shifted into slower songs, and the tension in the kitchen eased into a tired routine of cleaning and quiet conversation. I was wiping down a service station near the bar when Marco hurried past again with the nervous energy he always had around important guests. "Table 12 is finishing soon," he muttered while glancing toward the dining room. "Make sure everything looks perfect." I nodded automatically, though I knew the table had already received the best service in the building. A few minutes later, I carried a tray of espresso cups across the room and noticed that the men at that table had pushed their plates aside and were speaking more quietly now. One of them checked his watch while another leaned toward Alexander Kane and said something I could not hear. Kane listened without interrupting, his posture relaxed but attentive in the way someone listens when details matter. When their conversation ended, the men stood almost at the same moment, as if following a signal that did not need to be spoken aloud. Chairs slid quietly across the floor, and the small group prepared to leave. I stepped aside to give them space the way every waiter in the room did. Instinctively, and for a moment, I believed the entire strange encounter would simply end there with nothing more than an uncomfortable memory from a long shift. Then Alexander Kane paused beside the table. Instead of walking toward the door with the others, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a folded bill beneath the empty wine glass with a calm, deliberate motion. The gesture was ordinary enough, but the amount of money visible at the edge of the bill was larger than any tip I had ever seen in my 2 years working at Rossi's. Marco noticed it too, and his eyes widened slightly before he hurried away, pretending not to stare. The other men continued walking toward the entrance, leaving Kane a step behind them. For a moment he remained where he was standing, as if considering something unseen in the room. Then his gaze shifted across the dining area and settled on me again with that same quiet certainty I had begun to recognize. I froze beside the service station, unsure whether to approach or simply remain where I was. He did not gesture for me to come closer, and he did not say my name. Yet somehow the distance between us felt smaller than the 20 feet of marble floor separating the 2 points. After a second, he turned slightly toward the front doors where his associates were waiting and began to walk in their direction. I felt an unexpected wave of relief, thinking the moment had finally ended. But just before he reached the entrance, he stopped again and looked back once more across the room. Not long enough to draw attention, yet long enough that our eyes met a final time. And in that quiet glance, there was a strange sense of unfinished business, as if the question he had asked earlier had not truly been answered, and both of us knew it. The front doors of Rossi's closed softly behind Alexander Kane, and the quiet shift in the room was immediate. Not dramatic, not obvious, but the kind of subtle release people feel when a powerful presence leaves the space. Conversations slowly returned to their usual volume, and the string quartet continued playing as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet I stood beside the service station for a few seconds longer than necessary, trying to shake the strange tension that had followed me since the moment he walked in. Marco hurried over to table 12 almost before the chairs had cooled and lifted the wine glass to check the tip left beneath it. The moment he saw the folded bills, his eyebrows shot upward, and he let out a low whistle that he quickly tried to hide. "Well, that explains the suits," he muttered under his breath before glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed. I stepped closer out of curiosity, even though part of me already suspected what I would see: the stack of bills. Beneath the glass was thick enough that it looked unreal sitting on the white tablecloth. Marco counted them quickly with the quiet efficiency of someone who had worked in restaurants for decades, and then looked over at me with a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. "That man just tipped more than most people make in a week," he said quietly. "You must have impressed him tonight, Lily." I forced a small laugh, even though the comment made my stomach twist in a way I could not fully explain. "I do not think that was about service," I replied softly. Marco shrugged as if rich people rarely needed logical explanations for anything, and carried the money toward the office to record it properly. The dining room slowly returned to its normal rhythm as the last of the dinner guests finished their meals and the late evening crowd began to thin. By the time my shift finally ended, the restaurant felt quieter than it had all night. The chandeliers dimmed slightly, while the quartet packed their instruments, and the kitchen began the long process of cleaning and shutting down for the night. I changed out of my apron and grabbed my small bag from the staff locker, while Maria finished counting the dessert inventory beside me. "You are leaving already?" she asked with a tired smile. I nodded. My feet were sore, and the weight of the evening sat heavily in my shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with carrying trays. Stepping outside onto West 47th Street felt like stepping into a completely different world. The warm air of a Manhattan summer night wrapped around the block, and the glow of streetlights reflected off passing taxis and storefront windows. I walked toward the subway entrance 2 blocks away, keeping my head down, the way most New Yorkers do when they are simply trying to get home after a long shift. Yet the strange feeling from earlier had not completely faded. Something about the way Alexander Kane had watched the room stayed in the back of my mind like an unfinished thought. Halfway down the block, I paused briefly at a crosswalk waiting for the traffic light to change, and noticed a black sedan parked quietly along the curb across the street. It was the kind of car you might see outside luxury hotels or corporate buildings, polished and silent with tinted windows that revealed nothing about who might be inside. I barely gave it a second thought, because New York City was full of cars that looked exactly like that. The light changed, and I continued walking toward the subway stairs. Yet somewhere behind me the engine of that sedan started softly, and the vehicle eased away from the curb with the smooth, quiet motion of something that had simply been waiting for the right moment to move. The subway platform smelled like warm concrete and metal rails the way it always did after midnight in Manhattan. The late trains echoed through the tunnels, while tired commuters stood scattered along the platform staring at their phones or leaning against pillars with the quiet patience of people who had done this routine 1,000 times before. I stepped onto the platform and checked the digital sign above the tracks, which promised the next Queens-bound train would arrive in 6 minutes. Long enough for my feet to start aching again after standing for nearly 9 hours straight at Rossi's. I leaned back against a tiled column and adjusted the strap of my bag, while replaying the strange moments from earlier in the night. Alexander Kane's question had been simple, yet it lingered in my mind with an uncomfortable persistence. "Who did this to you?" I had heard questions like that before from coworkers and friends who noticed something unusual, but their voices always carried curiosity or sympathy. His voice had carried something else entirely, something quieter and harder to define, like someone placing a piece on a chessboard after already seeing the end of the game. The train roared into the station with a rush of wind that tugged lightly at my hair and sent loose papers fluttering along the platform floor. The door slid open and I stepped inside, finding a seat near the end of the car where only a few passengers sat scattered across the plastic benches. A young couple whispered to each other across from me while an older man in a business suit slept with his head tilted against the window. The train pulled away from the station and the tunnel lights streaked past in brief flashes that illuminated the car every few seconds. I rested my head against the cool glass beside me and closed my eyes for a moment, hoping the quiet ride would help clear the lingering tension from the evening. But the image of that calm, steady gaze across the restaurant refused to fade. As easily as I expected, when the train reached my stop in Queens, the night air outside felt cooler than the busy streets of Manhattan. The neighborhood was quieter too, with only a few storefront lights still glowing along the avenue and the distant sound of traffic humming somewhere beyond the apartment buildings. I walked the familiar 3 blocks toward my building with my hands tucked into the sleeves of my jacket the way I always did when the night felt too quiet. The streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk and a stray cat darted between 2 parked cars before disappearing into the darkness. Halfway down the block, I noticed headlights reflecting faintly in a shop window beside me and turned slightly, just in time to see a black sedan roll slowly past the intersection behind me. It was probably nothing more than another late-night driver searching for parking, yet the sight stirred a faint echo of recognition in my mind. I had seen a car like that earlier outside Rossi's, though I could not say for certain if it was the same one. The sedan continued down the street without slowing and disappeared around the corner, leaving the quiet neighborhood exactly the way it had been before. I reached my building a moment later and unlocked the front door, stepping into the dim hallway, where the scent of old paint and radiator heat hung in the air. By the time I climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment, the tension from the night had finally begun to fade, and exhaustion settled over me like a heavy blanket. I tossed my bag onto the small kitchen table and slipped off my shoes, letting the silence of the apartment close around me. For a few minutes, I simply stood there listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a television from the unit upstairs. The city outside continued moving the way it always did, while inside my apartment, everything felt still. And somewhere across that quiet distance, I could not shake the strange feeling that a question asked hours earlier had not truly ended when I left the restaurant. I woke the next morning to the pale gray light of early sunlight filtering through the thin curtains of my small apartment. The quiet hum of the city already beginning to rise outside. Even though the clock beside my bed read only 7:23 in the morning, my body still felt heavy from the late shift and the long subway ride home. But the strange tension from the night before lingered in my mind the way a half-remembered dream sometimes refuses to disappear after waking. I lay still for a moment, listening to the distant rumble of traffic several blocks away and the faint footsteps of someone walking down the hallway outside my door. Eventually, I pushed the blanket aside and stood up, crossing the small room to the kitchenette, where my coffee maker waited on the counter beside a stack of unpaid bills and yesterday's newspaper. The smell of fresh coffee slowly filled the apartment, bringing a small sense of normal routine back into the morning. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and leaned against the counter, staring out the window toward the street below, where delivery trucks and taxis were already beginning their daily dance through the neighborhood. Nothing about the morning looked unusual, and yet the memory of that quiet question inside Rossi's continued to echo. In my thoughts, who did this to you? I shook my head slightly, as if the movement might clear the thought away, and reached for the newspaper on the counter, flipping it open without much interest. Most of the headlines were the same, as always in New York City, stories about city council meetings and real estate prices and the never-ending flow of traffic through Midtown. But halfway down the front page, a smaller headline caught my attention and made my hand pause above the paper. It mentioned a series of unusual business closures that had occurred overnight across several neighborhoods in Manhattan. 3 different bars and a private gambling club had apparently shut their doors without explanation sometime before dawn. The article did not provide many details, and the reporter speculated that the closures might be related to licensing issues or financial problems. I read the paragraph twice before setting the paper down again, because something about the timing felt oddly familiar, even though I could not explain why. The memory of Alexander Kane's calm expression surfaced again, and I felt a faint ripple of unease move through my chest. It was probably nothing more than coincidence because New York was full of strange events every day, and people like him likely had nothing to do with small business headlines buried at the bottom of a newspaper page. I finished my coffee and prepared for another shift at Rossi's, tying my hair back and pulling on the same long-sleeve shirt I always wore to work even though the weather was warm enough for short sleeves. By the time I stepped outside, the city had fully awakened and the sidewalks buzzed with commuters rushing toward subway entrances and office buildings. The air smelled like roasted coffee from the corner cafe, mixed with the faint scent of car exhaust drifting along the avenue. I walked toward the subway station once again, trying to focus on the ordinary rhythm of the morning instead of the lingering questions from the night before. Yet as I descended the stairs toward the train platform, I could not shake the growing sense that something had quietly shifted somewhere beyond the edges of my small routine, the kind of change that most people would never notice until the consequences began to appear. The subway ride back to Manhattan felt shorter than usual that morning, even though the train made its usual stops beneath the city. The car filled with commuters reading news on their phones or staring quietly out the windows as the tunnel lights flashed past in steady rhythm. I stood near the door holding the metal pole while the train swayed gently from side to side and tried to push the strange thoughts from earlier out of my mind. By the time I stepped onto the busy platform near Times Square, the city was fully awake and moving with the fast, restless energy that only New York seemed to have. Street vendors arranged coffee cups beside stainless steel carts, while office workers hurried across intersections balancing phones and briefcases. The familiar rush of noise and motion felt grounding after the quiet unease that had followed me since the night before. When I arrived at Rossi's a few minutes before my shift, the restaurant was still preparing for the lunch crowd. The kitchen doors were open and the smell of fresh bread drifted through the dining room, while waiters polished glasses and set new silverware along the tables. Maria stood near the host's stand reading something on her phone with an expression that looked halfway between curiosity and surprise. When she noticed me walking in, she lifted the phone slightly, as if she had been waiting to show someone the screen. "Lily, have you seen this?" she asked. I shook my head and stepped closer while tying my apron around my waist. The screen showed a short news alert from one of the local stations reporting that several well-known nightlife locations across Manhattan had suddenly closed overnight, the same places I had seen mentioned in the newspaper earlier that morning. But now the report included more details and speculation about unusual inspections and financial investigations that had apparently happened late during the night. Nobody seemed to know exactly why the closures occurred so quickly, and the reporter described the situation as mysterious even by New York standards. I handed the phone back to Maria, trying to appear uninterested even though the article stirred the same faint sense of connection that had bothered me earlier. "New York businesses close all the time," I said casually while adjusting the sleeve of my shirt. She nodded but continued scrolling through the article with a thoughtful look. "Maybe, but 3 places at once is strange," she replied. Before I could answer, the front doors opened and Marco hurried inside, carrying a stack of reservation lists for the afternoon service. The usual preparation for another busy day began to fill the room as waiters moved quickly between tables arranging glasses and menus, while the kitchen staff called out early lunch orders from the back. I tried to focus on the routine of work again because routine was easier than questions. But as I moved through the dining room setting water pitchers along the service station, I noticed something unusual near the entrance. A black sedan was parked along the curb outside the restaurant exactly the way it had been the night before. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, and the polished surface of the car reflected the bright daylight like a mirror. It might have been waiting for someone inside the building, or it might have simply been another luxury vehicle passing through midtown traffic. Yet the sight of it sent a quiet ripple of recognition through my thoughts. I looked away quickly and returned to polishing the glasses in front of me, telling myself once again that it was probably nothing. But somewhere deep down the same feeling returned with quiet certainty, the feeling that events had begun to move in ways I could not yet see. The lunch rush at Rossi's began the way it always did, slowly at first, and then all at once, as if someone somewhere in Manhattan had flipped an invisible switch. Within 30 minutes, the quiet dining room filled with the familiar sounds of conversations, clinking glasses, and the steady movement of waiters weaving between tables carrying trays of pasta and sandwiches. I stayed focused on the rhythm of the shift because routine was the easiest way to keep my thoughts from drifting back to the strange details that had followed me. Since the night before, Table 3 asked for extra bread. Table 7 needed refills. Table 11 wanted the check. Simple tasks repeated over and over until the noise of the restaurant pushed everything else to the edges of my mind. Yet every time I passed the front windows, the reflection of that black sedan parked outside caught my eye again. It remained in the same place along the curb with its dark windows hiding whoever might be sitting inside. At first I told myself it was probably waiting for someone working in one of the nearby offices. Midtown traffic was full of drivers waiting for pickups. But after nearly 2 hours the car had not moved an inch. Around 1:30 in the afternoon the lunch crowd finally began to thin, and the pace inside the restaurant slowed just enough for people to breathe again. Maria leaned against the service counter beside me while we polished the last stack of wine glasses. She followed my glance toward the street and raised one eyebrow. "That car has been there all morning," she said quietly. I nodded, pretending not to care, even though the same uneasy feeling stirred again in my chest. "Probably waiting for someone important," I replied. She shrugged and returned to stacking the glasses without much interest because cars outside restaurants were rarely anyone's concern except the valet staff. A few minutes later the front door opened, and Marco stepped outside to speak with the delivery driver unloading crates of vegetables from a truck. Through the glass, I watched him glance toward the sedan briefly before returning to his conversation. Nothing about his reaction suggested the car was unusual to anyone except me. The rest of the afternoon continued with the steady flow of customers and orders while the sun moved slowly across the buildings outside. Sometime close to 3:15 the sedan finally came to life. I noticed it through the reflection in the window before I even realized why my attention had shifted. The engine started quietly, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb with the smooth motion of something that had never been in a hurry. It turned the corner at the end of the block and disappeared into the traffic of 7th Avenue, leaving the street looking completely ordinary again. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding and returned to clearing a nearby table. By the time the early dinner preparations began, the strange presence of that car had already started to feel like something imagined rather than real. Yet somewhere in the back of my mind the same quiet awareness remained. The sense that the calm routine of my day had been watched carefully from a distance I could not see. The late afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of Rossi's and painted long golden shapes across the marble floor as the restaurant prepared for the dinner service again. The quiet hours between lunch and evening felt almost peaceful compared to the rush earlier in the day, and most of the staff used the time to reset tables and catch their breath before the next wave of customers arrived. I stood near the service station folding fresh napkins into neat triangles while the soft hum of the city drifted through the glass doors at the front of the building. For a while the day felt completely ordinary again, and the strange tension that had followed me since the previous night seemed to fade into the background of routine. Maria returned from her break, carrying a paper cup of coffee, and leaned beside me at the counter. "You look like you slept about 3 hours," she said with a small smile. I shrugged and adjusted my sleeve the same way I always did without thinking. "Late shift." "Last night," I replied. She nodded and took a sip of coffee while glancing toward the street outside, where the afternoon traffic rolled steadily past. The black sedan from earlier was gone, and the sidewalk looked like any other block in Midtown, with tourists wandering past storefronts and office workers hurrying toward the subway entrances. Marco stepped out of the office a moment later holding a clipboard and began assigning dinner sections for the night. "Lily, you take the front half of the room again," he said while scanning the list. I nodded and placed the folded napkins into the drawer before moving to straighten the glasses on table 4. The simple routine of preparing for service helped push the lingering thoughts from my mind until the front doors opened suddenly and the cool evening air drifted into the restaurant. I glanced up expecting another early customer, but the moment my eyes reached the entrance, I felt the quiet shift in the room again. The same subtle pause that had happened the night before when a certain presence crossed the threshold. Alexander Kane stepped inside with the same calm confidence that seemed to move the air around him without effort. He wore a dark jacket and walked with unhurried steps, as if he had nowhere urgent to be, even though everyone nearby seemed instantly aware of him. Marco noticed him first and straightened his posture while hurrying toward the host's stand to greet him personally. "Good evening, sir." "Welcome back," he said with the careful politeness reserved for important guests. Kane nodded slightly and glanced around the dining room with that same attentive, calm gaze that noticed everything. For a brief moment his eyes passed across the tables and then stopped when they reached me standing near the service station. The recognition in his expression was quiet but unmistakable, and it carried the same weight it had the night before. The room continued moving around us with waiters adjusting chairs and the kitchen doors swinging open behind the bar, yet the moment felt strangely still, as if the rest of the noise had faded into the distance. Marco gestured toward the same corner table from the previous evening, and Kane walked toward it without speaking. His attention lingered on me for one more second before he turned away to sit down. And in that small silent exchange I realized with growing certainty that whatever question had begun the night before had not been forgotten. For the rest of the room, Alexander Kane was just another wealthy customer returning to a favorite restaurant. But for me, the air seemed to change the moment he sat down again at the same corner table. The quiet weight of his presence settled over the evening like a question waiting for an answer. Marco handed me the wine list and nodded toward the table with the kind of polite urgency managers use when important guests arrive. "Lily, take care of him," he said softly. I swallowed and smoothed the front of my apron before walking across the dining room with the steady professional steps I had practiced for years. The soft light of the chandeliers reflected off the polished glasses as I approached, and I reminded myself that this was just another customer and another table. "Good evening," I said, placing the wine list gently in front of him. "Welcome back." Alexander Kane looked up from the table with the same calm attention he had shown the night before, as if he had been expecting that I would be the one to greet him. "Good evening, Lily," he replied, and the sound of my name in his voice made me pause for half a second before I remembered to breathe. The fact that he remembered my name was not surprising in a busy restaurant where managers often introduce staff to important guests, yet hearing it spoken so calmly carried a strange sense of intention. "Can I bring you something to drink?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Just coffee for now," he answered. "Black." I nodded and turned toward the kitchen, preparing to leave the table when his voice stopped me again. "Lily." The way he said my name this time was quiet, but deliberate enough that I turned back instinctively. "Are you safe today?" he asked. The question was simple and spoken without accusation or drama, yet it carried the same quiet weight as the one from the night before. For a moment, I did not know how to answer because the question itself felt unexpected in the middle of a normal restaurant shift. "I am fine," I said after a second, forcing a small polite smile. "It has been a normal day." He studied my expression for a moment as if measuring the truth behind the words, and then nodded slowly. "That is good," he said calmly. Something in his tone suggested that the answer mattered more than the conversation itself. I returned to the kitchen and prepared the coffee with slightly unsteady hands before carrying the cup back across the dining room. When I placed it in front of him, he thanked me quietly and lifted the cup without looking away from me. The restaurant around us continued filling with customers, and the evening rush began to rise again with the familiar sounds of orders and conversations, but the quiet space at that corner table felt different from the rest of the room. After a moment, he set the cup down again and spoke once more in the same calm tone. "If anyone troubles you, Lily, you should tell them something," he said. I hesitated, unsure whether the words were meant as advice or something else entirely. "What should I tell them?" I asked quietly. Alexander Kane met my eyes with a steady expression that held no anger and no arrogance, only a quiet certainty that seemed impossible to argue with. "Tell them my name," he replied. The words lingered in the air between us long after he said them. Simple and quiet, yet somehow heavier than the noise of the entire dining room around us. "Tell them my name." For a moment, I stood there holding the empty tray against my side, unsure how to respond, because the statement sounded less like a suggestion and more like a certainty. The restaurant continued moving in its usual rhythm as customers filled tables and waiters carried plates through the aisles, while the kitchen doors swung open behind the bar with bursts of heat and conversation. Yet the small corner where Alexander Kane sat seemed strangely untouched by the noise. I nodded slowly, more out of instinct than understanding, and offered the same polite smile I gave every customer. "I will remember that," I said quietly before stepping away from the table. The rest of the evening unfolded with the steady routine that had defined my life for years. Orders were taken, glasses refilled, checks delivered, and by the time the dinner rush faded into the late night, quiet, the strange tension that had followed me since the previous evening felt different than it had before. It was no longer the uneasy uncertainty of a question waiting for an answer, but something steadier and harder to explain. Sometime after 10:30, the last guests began leaving the restaurant, and the staff moved through the familiar process of closing down the dining room for the night. Chairs were lifted onto tables, and the lights dimmed slightly. While the kitchen staff cleaned the counters behind the swinging doors, Alexander Kane remained at his table longer than most customers, speaking occasionally with Marco, in low, calm tones that I could not hear from across the room. Eventually, he stood and placed his coffee cup carefully back onto the saucer before adjusting the sleeve of his jacket. When he turned toward the door, his gaze passed over the room one last time and paused briefly where I stood near the service station. There was no dramatic gesture and no final conversation, yet the look he gave me carried the same quiet certainty that had been present since the moment he first walked into Rossi's. Then he nodded once and stepped out into the Manhattan night. The front doors closed behind him, and the familiar noise of the city returned to fill the space he left behind. I finished stacking the last row of glasses and untied my apron, feeling the exhaustion of the long shift settle into my shoulders. Outside the windows, the streetlights reflected across passing cars, and the sidewalks buzzed with the late-night energy of Midtown. For most people, the evening had been nothing more than another ordinary night in the city, but as I stepped outside and felt the cool air of the street brush against my face, I realized something had changed in a way I could not fully describe. Somewhere beyond the small routine of my life, a quiet promise had been made without contracts or explanations. And in a city where millions of people move through their days unseen and unheard, the knowledge that someone powerful had decided to notice felt like the beginning of a story that neither of us had planned, but both of us now understood would not simply disappear.